everybody, and welcome
Hi.
to episode 8 of Cookie Pocket, an attempt at a podcast. Today we're going to be talking about The Abominable Dr. Phibes, a 1971 comedy horror film directed by Robert West and starring Vincent Price as a mad organist whose wife dies in an operation and who is scarred while attempting to rush to her side while she is dying, who decides to take revenge on the 10 doctors who failed to save her, killing each of them in a method that coincides to one of the plagues of Egypt. Sound confusing and weird? It kind of is. So, as usual, why don't we start with our overall thoughts? Christian and Mitchell, what did you think of the movie?
Well,
I'll go first.
Oh my goodness.
Just kidding.
All right.
Christian can go first. That's
Oh.
fine.
Oh my goodness, we're gonna have to take this bit out back and shoot it next episode. Here we go. I had fun. I didn't hate it. So I liked it more than The Changeling.
All right.
I was certainly not bored. Like you said beforehand, Zach. There's always something going on, which is great, and not something that is, I think, often untrue with movies as old as this one.
Mhm.
But it was also kind of hard to follow, at least at the beginning. Like once you're kind of settled in and you're thinking about it critically, eventually you catch on. And there's just a couple like drawbacks with just plot wise. There are a lot of kind of question marks there about why are these 10 doctors responsible for the death of his wife necessarily, and there's also a couple pitfalls, I think, for me that come with the time period that the film was in.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly just like if I remember correctly, there's only one female character that speaks the entire time, and the Dr. Phibes' female assistant is kind of like the lead female of sorts in the movie, but she literally doesn't speak at all. And when the credits roll, the characters kind of all get these labels, and her label is the girl, and it's just kind of like an eye roll thing where it's like a little sexist maybe, and to me that's a point of criticism. But overall, I enjoyed it despite its flaws. I was thankful that I wasn't bored, and I thought it balanced horror and comedy well. Mm-hmm. So overall, I gave it a 2 out of 5.
Rightio. Mitchell?
I wasn't really sure how I felt about it in the beginning, because I wasn't really sure what type of horror it really was. I think going in blind was more of a benefit than anything, though, because as it kind of progressed and I saw the different aspects of it that were repetitive, then I kind of knew what the film was definitely going for. And like Christian had said in his Twitter review, the set pieces look really good and everything, and just kind of like the weird Tim Burton-esque. It reminds me of Tim Burton a lot. Mm-hmm. The very campy aspects of it, and some of it is the time period, but I really think like maybe 80 to 90% of it is intentional.
Oh yeah.
There's a lot of intentional irony and black comedy here, and such aspects as the police not being very competent is kind of a part of their character. I feel like they're written that way on purpose a lot, for at least most of the. It's kind of hard to tell, like, looking back this far back, how much of it was purposeful and how much of it was just really outdated. But I think that's kind of just going away from the main themes just by trying to go down that hole. But just have it, the general premise, the 10 plagues of Egypt plot and the revenge plot, and I don't know, just the Vincent Price is amazing, and he captures that, the macabre, twisted villain role very, very well. He pulls it off very well in this, and the acoustics, aspect of it is very creative. So there's really a lot of creative horror aspects of this. I would consider this probably one of like the more original horror movies. There's a lot of original content here. And that there's a lot to be appreciated, but I think it's a little bit too campy for my taste, and a lot of it that is a lot of the black comedy doesn't really pull off very well 50 years later.
Okay.
but and like I said, I you know, it is kind of outdated in some aspects, but you know, overall, I really did enjoy it. I enjoyed it a lot more than I had once thought in the beginning. And it was actually kind of boring too, but once the plot unraveled and you know the purpose behind everything, for you know the purpose behind Phibes, you know his whole plot and everything, or everything unraveling made me enjoy it a whole lot more in the end, and I was able to appreciate it for what it was.
Yeah, I would say this is not a movie that I necessarily love. I don't put it up there as like one of my favorite movies, but it is a movie that I really appreciate what it's going for. As you mentioned, Mitchell, I think there's tons and tons of creativity here, and I really like how this movie basically plays absolutely no heed at all to how you're supposed to tell this kind of story and how you're supposed to do this sort of a narrative. You guys all mentioned at the beginning, one of the reasons I think the beginning of this movie sort of loses people is that for the first like 20 to 30 minutes of this movie, you don't really exactly know what's happening or who these people are that are being killed. Phibes himself doesn't even speak until like 30 minutes into the actual film. So there's a lot of trust kind of placed in the audience as to them sort of paying attention and going along with what the director and the writer are doing. It doesn't necessarily guide the audience along that much, as it kind of throws ideas at the audience and sort of asks them to trust them until those ideas are revealed or explained later, which I really appreciate. We've all talked about the tone a little bit, but I think we should go into that a little bit deeper. What were your thoughts on kind of the overall feel of this movie? Did you find it funny? Did you find it frightening, gruesome in places? What did you guys think?
I mean, I don't know. I think I was never really like genuinely frightened, like scared. And I sort of made comments in one of our past episodes about just older horror films in general having good effects for that time period, but effects that don't make me think, oh my gosh, this is life-threatening, I'm scared. But more like, oh, that looks cool, I can understand why somebody in the 70s would be scared. Yeah. So it's kind of like a balancing act between that, but to that extent, I guess the horror worked well. I kind of agree with Mitchell to some extent about like the campy elements of it. Like I got really, really, really frustrated with the inspectors and how stupid they were. My goodness, they are so bad at their jobs. It is unbelievable. And I felt like their boss was sort of meant to be like the comedic element, and they were supposed to be the straight men of sorts in that relation. Or that's what it felt like to me. But at the same time, I was like empathizing with the boss. Every time the boss came on and yelled at them, I was like, "Yeah, do your job better." So I mean, I don't know. It's frustrating as much as it is funny. So, it's so hard to describe that it's really difficult to critique both at the same time. I would say, but I think they pulled it off about as well as they could have, and given the time period and the original ideas, I applaud them for what they did do.
Yeah. Okay. Mitchell, what did you think?
I think this is very notable in that there's very little surface kind of scares. Everything that's very creepy about it, there's a lot of depth to it. They explain everything that's creepy. Like, at least you know why Phibes has all of these different gadgets and why he's kind of going to such an extent to commit these murders and things like that. And it's just that I think that really contributes to the tone. I mean, just getting beyond Vincent Price's acting, I think that a lot of what is actually not frightening, like Christian had said, but very creepy, ominous, maybe actually less ominous, more like, in your face, disturbing. But I mean, it's like Vincent Price is obviously very concerned and very, he's enraged, and you feel that every single time he's on the screen. And I'm only mentioning him a lot because he's probably like the only actual thing that makes this totally frightening. I think his assistant is a little is purposely underused. But
Yeah.
I mean, but yeah, the way that he commits the murders, and whenever his very Shakespearean lines are that's kind of what contributes to the tone the most, and that's probably one of my favorite aspects of this whole film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would cut in real quick and say I was genuinely frightened by the bats. Like, that was the one thing that did get me. I thought that was really freaky and well done. And later when the inspectors come in and the guy's face is messed up and the bats, that was genuinely spooky. That was really well done.
Okay. Yeah, I would say, to me at least, this feels like a movie that's trying to be a lot funnier than it is scary. There are bits in this that feel like they came out of a Pink Panther movie, and like some of the most obvious I think are there's a point in the film where multiple doctors have been killed, and the police officers are trying to escort this one doctor to safety, and they open the door for him, and a brass unicorn gets shot across the street and impales him against the wall, and then they just look at him for a second, and then they have to unscrew him because he's impaled into the wall. I think that moment is absolutely intended, like, just for laughs. I don't think you can look at that moment and say it's trying to be scary.
And then the guy reading the newspaper.
Yeah, there's also tons of little verbal moments. Like, everybody, the lead detective's name is Trout, and people constantly mistakenly call him Pike instead of Trout because of the fish. Yeah. There's another moment where Trout is talking to kind of the boss, like you pointed out, Christian, and he keeps like correcting him, and then at one point the boss says, "Are you in the habit of contradicting your superiors?" And then he can't say anything because if he says no, he's just proved the point. I like little things like that. Yeah. I think there are really fun little moments of comedy in here, but I will say there are moments in this that I think in concept are very creepy, and have gone on to kind of influence other people and be used in creepier ways later. Mitchell mentioned kind of the overall Tim Burton-esque look. I think this movie was probably a big influence on a young Tim Burton, who went on to cast Vincent Price and things, so it's quite likely he saw this film. But other things include the kind of big finale of this film feels a lot like Saw, in that there's a character with a key embedded in his body and somebody else has got to cut it out, and there's a strict time limit or else they'll both be killed. The overall concept of somebody killing a list of people according to a biblical list feels a lot like Seven, although in that film it's the 7 deadly sins instead of the plagues of Egypt. There's a scene where Phibes drains a man of all of his blood and puts it in glass jars, which feels a lot like a scene in Exorcist 3, where somebody is drained of all his blood and it's put in plastic jars. So I do feel like this film has maybe had an influence on a lot of other films that went on to be creepier than it. I just don't necessarily think it's trying to use those creepy ideas to be creepy in this film as much as it's trying to be over the top and campy and funny. Now, Christian, you mentioned the sets, at least in your Twitter review. I think we should talk a bit about the overall sort of look and feel of the film, the sort of design of the film. What do we think of that, the sort of Art Deco look?
Sure. Yeah, overall, I was just really impressed by the way everything looked, particularly Phibes' hideout of sorts, especially the area in which he performs with his masked and/or animatronic band. I'm not really sure, but it was creepy and it worked, so whatever. And I think the sets being built so beautifully, particularly that location, is added weight to the epilogue being basically destroying everything and basically letting it all burn now that he's completed his purpose or whatever. And so yeah, I think it's really special that they got a technical element that worked really well for them, that could also impact the plot in the way that the events actually unravel on the screen, and that the execution on a technical level can help the execution on a writing level. To me, that was really cool and something you pretty much never see, or at least something I've rarely seen in a film. So yeah, that added to it for me.
Mitchell?
What do you want to ask me?
Any thoughts on the look and feel of the movie?
Well,
the designs, the sets, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, Tim Burton, but
Yeah, Yeah.
Yeah, no, I really liked it. It kind of reminded me of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory towards the
Oh.
end.
Mhm.
You can't blame me for that. Put it side
Oh
by
no.
side, you'll know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, just normal things being very twisted, and having like sciencey stuff mixed with like medical stuff, and like I said, very original. That's a very original design, I think. Just having that weird, and the 1920s vibe also. I was going to
Mhm.
mention that because a lot of the reason I think the cops are actually really dumb. If you read a lot of the stories from Jack the Ripper from like the 1880s, it's like really similar because
Mm.
the police look like very incompetent when you're reading their pursuit of Jack the Ripper, and like you have no idea how he got away with it. So this
Yeah.
actually reminds me a lot of that. And Jack the Ripper pursued women very similarly how Dr. Phibes pursued doctors
Mhm.
involved with his wife. So but yeah, no, in terms of the visual effects, very good. I don't think they could have really been any better trying to fit the aesthetic.
Yeah, it's interesting you point out Jack the Ripper. I hadn't even thought of that. I had kind of thought. I mean, the police inspectors in this, although they are kind of the comic relief, most of the time it feels like there's a scene with Phibes that is serious, and then there's a scene with the inspectors that's meant for comedy. The lead inspector, Trout, does do a decent amount of like actual detective work. I mean, he tracks down the person who designed the different amulets that Phibes uses, and then he gets a description of Volnavia from that guy. He tracks down the different team and tries to put them under guard, even though they fail for all of them. But it is, I think it's interesting you point out Jack the Ripper, because if you think back to those news stories, before kind of we had a modern understanding of kind of forensic science and crime scenes, cops did a lot of comparatively kind of dumb things when they were at scenes of crimes. There's stories from the Jack the Ripper case of, people mopping up piles of blood and things like that because they didn't want to disturb the citizens. There was some graffiti that was considered a clue above the body of one woman in the Jack the Ripper cases, and somebody demanded that it be wiped away before it could be officially logged or investigated
my
because
God.
it might disturb people. So there are kind of those little ineptitudes on the behalf of historical cops that does make kind of this film similar to Jack the Ripper. I hadn't even thought of that. An interesting thing I think about sort of the look and feel of this movie is it was filmed on the 1920s era sets at Elstree Studios. But to me, at least, the vibe it's going for feels almost a little more like 1930s in sort of the type of story it's telling. Even though the story's set in 1925, this feels to me almost like a send up of like old Fu Manchu serials.
Yeah.
The way that Fu Manchu has all these like elaborate traps and devices set up in all those old serials. Similarly, Phibes has just a device he can use to make vegetable juice in order to use in the killing of this one nurse. He obviously has a clockwork band just in a closet somewhere. Like, it feels very much like they're sort of poking fun at that old Ming the Merciless Fu Manchu style villain, despite the fact that that's maybe a couple years outside of the decade that this is actually set in. Mitchell, you've mentioned Vincent Price a couple times. I think we should kind of talk about him overall a little bit more. What did we think of basically our leading man of this film, Vincent Price, and of the character he's playing, Dr. Phibes?
Well, I don't know. I think I didn't necessarily want to go first because I have a strong feeling I might be a bit of a dissenting opinion here.
Ooh.
I didn't dislike him. I won't go that far.
Mhm.
I think he performs to his mandate perfectly well, and I think it's an added challenge to like physicalize all of your lines and then speak all of your lines at a later date that matches the physicalizations that you did at a separate time, and they all have to line up really well. And at a couple points towards the end, when he's talking to the last doctor, there were like a couple little bits where his physicality didn't totally line up with the dubs, which is kind of unavoidable and not a huge deal, I guess. But overall, I don't know. For the first half of the movie, I was kind of frustrated because he's just kind of standing there looking menacing, and he's kind of got the same facial expression for the majority of the film. And I don't know. I guess that's kind of what his character should be and what he should have done. But I guess my point is maybe the performance isn't necessarily a huge uh, testament to his talent necessarily,
Mm-hmm.
but more of a he did what he was supposed to do and he was fine. I don't know.
Mhm.
I'm not necessarily have any strong critiques outside of the facial expression being really similar throughout, but I guess there's kind of like a monotone feel to his character that matches his speech patterns in quotes,
Yeah.
and the idea that he's less of a man than he once was.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, in a sense, there's almost like I might be reaching here, but I think you could argue that like characters like Darth Vader could take inspiration from that type of approach, really. So credit to that. But overall, I guess my point is it's not as big of an acting challenge, so
Mhm.
it might not deserve widespread critical acclaim. But
Mm-hmm.
he did his job well, and he was sufficiently frightening.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
I
an
definitely think. No,
You go
was it
ahead, Mitchell.
interesting, Zach? Was it interesting?
Okay, I was just going to comment. I think it's interesting you point out Darth Vader, because kind of the origin of Dr. Phibes is weirdly similar to Darth Vader, now that I think about it.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, they both have their wives die right before they're horrifically burned,
Yeah.
and then sort of mechanized and turned into only a partial human. So that is a weird little connection. But Mitchell, I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No, you interrupted me, Zach. Anyway,
Wait, isn't that what he just?
the same thing. Okay. No, yeah, Christian's exactly right about this being a very easy part for him. This is I think they probably had to guide him a lot more in this part than his best parts. And the reason why I say that is because like in House of Haunted Hill, House of Wax, and I don't know, The Pin and the Pendulum. I could just pretty much
Yeah.
mention any other Vincent Price horror movie, and at least those popular ones at the very least, and say that those were more embodying to his acting potential and his nuances, and yeah, I think he had to do very little in this part to really portray the character that they wanted that they clearly wanted him to portray.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's a terrible thing. I mean, if he did exactly what he was supposed to do, you can't really ask any more of him. The only thing you could ask more of is more speaking parts. But I think that, how his character is, and this is very similarly to Darth Vader. What little he says is very powerful and important. So.
Mm-hmm.
True.
Yeah, I would say Vincent Price is an actor that I have a complicated opinion on. Throughout much of the 60s and 70s, he was kind of the third wheel to Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee in a lot of British horror movies. They appeared in a lot of movies together. They were all good friends. And I would say that of the three, Price is probably, or was, probably the least diverse of an actor, I would say. It's not that he always played himself in movies or anything like that, but every film that he's in, you're always aware that it's Vincent Price playing a character, which I don't necessarily think is bad. And it didn't necessarily typecast him horrifically. I mean, he was in, like, The Ten Commandments. Modern viewers would probably know him best as the narrator in the Thriller video.
Yeah.
And he's also in Edward Scissorhands as the inventor, which was his last role. But
Dr. Goldfoot and the Bikini Machine.
I wasn't going to mention that one, but
I'm not even gonna ask. What that
he is in that. But I think that he has this sort of sinister eloquence that he brings to every role, where it's always very clear that's Vincent Price. Like, he never vanishes into a role or anything like that, but it's almost comforting. It's like a fun, sinister nightmare blanket. Like, whenever you're watching a movie with Vincent Price in it, you're always like, okay, this is fun. Vincent Price is here. And I would say this movie's no exception to that rule. I think he's fun in this movie. You guys didn't seem to be like overwhelmed by his performance or anything like that, which I would agree with. This isn't like an Oscar-winning performance or anything, but there are lots of, I think, nice little subtle ticks here. The character of Dr. Phibes, his face is essentially meant to be like a wax mask. At the end, he like peels it off, and you see his burnt skull-like face. So throughout most of the movie, he has to express himself mostly with little movements of his eyes, tiny little gestures of his mouth. The way he moves his neck and head is kind of how he expresses himself a lot of the time. And as you mentioned, Christian, his voice comes out of like a phonograph that they obviously recorded the lines and kind of a robotic way later and had to sort of match them up. So I feel, given the difficulties and restrictions placed on him by the character, he does a pretty good job here. And, I mean, Phibes himself, I think, as we mentioned, is pretty much the leading man of the movie. I think throughout the course of he's even credited as the protagonist in the credits.
Whoa, I didn't see that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you move through the film, despite the fact that he's doing really awful things, you kind of start to not appreciate his perspective, because obviously these 10 doctors should not die, but you sort of start to really feel the depths of love that he has for his wife, and you sort of start to understand that, meaning that the ending where he sort of puts the plague of darkness upon himself and dies and goes to sleep forever next to his wife as Over the Rainbow plays, it comes across, at least to me, the ending feels a little more sweet necessarily than it does like, oh, he got away. It feels kind of like a bittersweet, tragic ending more than it
Han
feels
Solo
like
and Carbonite.
Yeah, well, sort of. Yeah, like Han Solo and Carbonite, rather than, oh, I'll get to you next time, Phibes. It doesn't feel like that. It's much more of an emotional ending, I'd say, which I think is kind of a testament to Price's performance.
Yeah, I was going to ask about. I thought the ending was really good, like you just mentioned, but I saw on IMDb that apparently they made a sequel of this. Am I correct?
Yeah, I saw that too.
Why would they do that? It's such a good ending, and you completely undo that by making another one.
I totally agree. I've seen the sequel as well. I saw both of these films a long time ago, when I watched pretty much exclusively nothing but early 70s horror movies. And I think this one is way, way better than the second one. Because this one, you've got the biblical plagues motivation, so you've got a nice little kind of structure to hang the movie on. And in the sequel, Dr. Phibes Rises Again, they made it because the first one was a big success. But they didn't have a sequel going in, obviously.
So it was a franchise film.
It was an attempt. It was an attempt at a franchise film, and essentially, it suffers in, I think, a lot of the ways that non-planned sequels suffer. Dr. Phibes is no longer committing murders because it's according to some biblical structure. He's committing murders because people get in the way. The idea is not like avenging the death of his wife, which is something he can never change, and he's just out to get revenge. In the sequel, he goes to Egypt and tries to get like the elixir of life to bring his wife back to life. The entire first movie is shrugged off as like, I needed an alibi so people didn't think it was me. It's not a good movie. But it was a success despite not being very good. They actually planned several other sequels, like the Brides of Dr. Phibes, but they never went anywhere, and I think it's a good thing, because the first one can stand on its own. You didn't need that first sequel at all.
Yeah.
Now that brings us to the end of my discussion notes, but before we go into the rundown, I think we should, any final thoughts, as we usually do.
Okay, I'll go first, because I talked first, Mitchell. I will just say, like, to Vincent Price's credit, Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee are really, really tough company to be around when you're trying to prove yourself as an actor. My goodness. Like, those are two of, I mean, Zach and I both adore those actors for two very different reasons, but they're obviously, like, paragons of cinema. I mean, so, I don't know. In defense of Vincent Price, I'll say that. But, overall, I had fun, and I think this is a really good film to talk about. Like, in my head, I always kind of separate my critical opinion of the movie from how good would this movie be for us to talk about. And even though I would say to this point, A New Hope was probably is probably my favorite movie that we've discussed so far.
Mhm.
It probably wasn't my favorite movie to discuss so far. So, and in that sense, I guess what I'm trying to say is this was a great movie to discuss, and I think that made my viewing experience better. So, thank you, Zach, for choosing this. Yeah, I guess my issues with it are kind of just what we said before. The inspectors being really dumb just frustrated me more than it humored me. I would say the one comedic moment that really hit me was the brass unicorn. Like, that was, I literally laughed out loud. I was like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
But I'm going to choose to enjoy this instead of nitpick it. So, yeah, it was fun. Vincent Price was good. And 2 out of 5.
Okay.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this, both as a Vincent Price movie and as an early 70s horror movie. There's not really... I mean, in terms of my recommendation, I would say probably watch this once, and maybe that's it, just to get the experience, because I really do think the exponential development of the plot, and also the mixture of the comedy and the horror, because earlier on it kind of goes from a lot of comedy, a lot of horror, a lot of comedy, and then towards the end it kind of goes comedy, horror, comedy, and it kind of like mixes together once the inspectors confront Dr. Phibes. But those aspects of it, the very eerie Tim Burton parts of it, and the campiness are very original. This is very, like, this is probably one of the most original horror movies I've ever seen, actually.
Wow.
In terms of like just having, creative elements in how the deaths are, and more creative than a lot of slasher movies, that's for sure. But yeah, it's unique, and it only, you have to be very considerate of the time period, and very considerate of the themes and what the main messages are, and how silly a lot of it can be.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you're relatively prepared for that, I would say this is, a pretty enjoyable experience. I'd say it maybe more enjoyable if you watch it with people who have similar horror interests to you. But yeah, I really did enjoy it. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Oh, and the score is pretty good too. Ominous score.
It is.
Yeah.
Didn't even mention
Agreed.
that.
Yeah, I do kind of I like a lot of the big band kind of jazzy music that's in this, in harsh contrast to more gruesome moments. There's a scene towards the beginning where a guy is killed at a party by a frog mask that squeezes his head until he dies, and there's just a jazzy tune in the background and somebody's singing. And I think that's kind of a gruesomely funny little moment. Sort of a sub-question. This is kind of a part of a horror genre, like you mentioned, Mitchell. Very specific horror genre from like the early 70s that mixes quite a bit of campy comedy with maybe lower key, not especially horrific horror. Did this movie maybe have you guys interested to check more films like that out, or is this kind of like I've had my one, now I'm done type thing?
It's more like a one and done type of thing. I wouldn't say like I would watch only one of this type of horror and then be done with it, but I'd have to watch a lot more horror movies in between, because, I mean, there's a lot to tolerate, and tolerating it is worth it, but, you still kind of feel the effects of it afterwards. Just like it's a trip. It's a real trip. It's an acid trip.
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of similarly to Mitchell. I think I'm kind of at your mercy with regard to this genre, Zach. I kind of watch what you tell me to watch, and I trust your recommendations to a point. And even if I don't enjoy something you point out to me, I know that it will have merit one way or another and be worth my time. So that's kind of where I am with this genre. And I mean, with this movie, I didn't want to get too much into the nitpicky bits that bothered me, because like for example, when he drills the hole in the ceiling and he's dripping the green goo, and it's like this tiny hole, but somehow he gets the goo across the lamp and then across her and across her face, and then in a shot afterwards nothing's on the lamp, so there's like a continuity error there. I didn't want to go on and on about stuff like that.
Okay.
But like just little bits like that kind of bothered me, even though in the grand scheme of things they're not important. And even though I wouldn't call this film boring, I still think it requires patience and investment to understand it. So I don't know if I would necessarily have that for every film that falls into this genre whenever I have free time to watch a movie. So I don't know. Kind of at your mercy again with horror stuff, and I'm fine with that.
Okay. I didn't even notice that shot with the lamp, but I would say I think there are some shots in this movie that, even though I think this is a pretty good looking movie overall, you can kind of tell it was made on a low budget, but I think overall it looks pretty good. I like Robert West's direction. There's lots of nice little subtle camera movements and rack focuses, but I think there are a few shots in there that feel like Robert West thought they would look cool on the day and they just had to do them, but they didn't necessarily plan for them, which kind of leads to continuity errors. That lamp scene being one of them. That lamp scene to me screams like Robert West getting out from behind the camera and going, well, wait a minute, what if we dripped it on the lamp and then we got a shot of her head? Which I can relate to. I mean, that happens when you're on sets, but if it happens at the expense of the continuity, that's not great. I would say I'm pretty much in agreement with you guys. This is not a perfect movie. This is a very campy movie. I think it's... If you watch this nowadays, I doubt you'll be scared necessarily. There are some creepy ideas in there, but the original trailer for this film marketed it as possibly the most terrifying film you'll ever see, which it absolutely is not. This is a fun, campy little experience. If you like Vincent Price, this is pretty much exactly the type of film you'd see kind of campy, glib, charming Vincent Price in. And if you like that kind of movie, I would say you definitely need to check this out. And if you don't necessarily love that kind of movie, I'd recommend maybe giving it a look. It's fun. The original tagline made fun of love stories, so if you don't like a love story, maybe check it out just for the thrill of that. I would give it a 3 out of 5 myself. I think it's a solid, good picture. But without further ado, it's time for...
The rundown.
Hey!
1 minute. We throw verbal things at Zach. He gives us a number out of 5. That means nothing. Okay. Mitchell, you gonna start this one?
Maybe I will.
Okay. Well, 3, 2, 1. Go.
Taking the Old Testament too seriously.
3 out of 5.
Catapulting brass unicorn heads.
4 out of 5.
Bats.
2 out of 5.
Rats.
3 out of 5.
London Aeroplane Club.
3 out of 5.
Vincent Price's mustache.
4 out of 5.
Organ music.
4 out of 5.
Destroying everything for no reason.
3 out of 5.
The ridiculous extent of the stupidity of British law enforcement / dumb cops.
3 out of 5.
Inevitable acid drip machine that apparently had an off switch the entire time.
3 out of 5.
Continuity errors.
2 out of 5.
The Clockwork Wizards.
4 out of 5.
Peter Jeffries, Inspector Trout.
3 out of 5.
The Sets.
4 out of 5.
Using one's knowledge of music and acoustics to recreate one's voice.
4 out of 5.
Masquerades.
3 out of 5.
The trappings of a sexist film.
3 out of 5.
Dr. Vesalius wearing a mask.
4 out of 5.
1 second.
Your face.
4 out of 5.
We cheated a little bit
Wow.
there. I'm sorry I gave you
Wow.
the trappings of a sexist film, Mitchell. I was supposed to say that one.
Oh, wow.
No, maybe I should. That's
was
a 2
my
out of
fault.
5.
Maybe
not a
no
3 out
one
of
should
5.
have said anything.
Yes.
Oh, my
maybe,
goodness.
Maybe not.
Oh,
well.
I would argue that, I mean,
No.
I'm kind of going past our time here, but I would
Yeah.
argue I've always seen Volnavia as potentially being like a robot or like a weird creation of Dr. Phibes rather than like an actual person, which doesn't explain to me why she can't necessarily speak. But that in itself sounds even more problematic than what you were suggesting.
Yeah, agreed.
So-
And also,
No.
the way she reacts to the acid falling on her is not... I don't think it's robotic. I think it's a human. Anyway, we're
That is
running
fair.
past our time.
We are running past our
Mitchell's
time.
right with the siren.
So,
That was what?
So, as we bring this episode to a close, and Christian is still in the punishment booth from his 2 Star Wars episodes, Mitchell, what are we going to be talking about next time?
Beauty and the Beast. 1991.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Walt Disney feature, 30th feature film, one of my favorite animated movies of all time.
Oh.
Probably my favorite Disney movie of all time. There you go.
Sweet.
Well, okay. So if you're interested in hearing us talk about Beauty and the Beast, you're a better Angela Lansbury than I am. Tune in next time to Cookie Pocket, an attempt at a podcast. Until then, adios.
See you later.